Welcome to U.S. History to 1877. In this course, you will survey the major themes, events, and ideas of American history through Reconstruction.
I'm Jordan O'Connell, History and Government Instructor at Northeast Iowa Community College. This lecture distills a decade of my written notes taken from Alan Brinkley's The Unfinished Nation, The American Yawp, and our course-assigned OpenStax U.S. History textbook. This lecture focuses on election panic, convention logic, and secession as elite political choice. The core question is this: when does fear of losing political control become a decision to destroy the Union? The core competency is to describe the political events that resulted in declarations of secession. When does fear of losing political control become a decision to destroy the Union? Secession became possible when many Southern slaveholding leaders concluded that the existing Union no longer guaranteed slavery's future. That conclusion was built over several years. The Dred Scott decision of 1857 played a major role. Dred Scott had lived with his owner in free territory and sued for freedom. Chief Justice Roger B. Taney wrote the majority opinion in Dred Scott v. Sanford. The court declared that Black people could not be citizens of the United States and that Congress lacked authority to prohibit slavery in the territories. The opinion tried to settle a political crisis with constitutional finality. Instead, it convinced many Northerners that slaveholding interests were seeking national protection for slavery beyond the older regional framework. If Congress could not restrict slavery in the territories, then territorial expansion could remain open to slave property across the West. The ruling therefore intensified the very conflict it hoped to close. At the same time, party arithmetic was changing. The Republican Party had formed in the 1850s around opposition to slavery's expansion. Its voters were concentrated in the North, and that concentration altered the electoral map. A Northern sectional party now had a realistic path to the presidency. Because free state population growth was increasing Northern weight in the Electoral College and the House of Representatives, Southern leaders could see the demographic direction. Even before Abraham Lincoln won in 1860, they could see that old cross-sectional bargains were getting weaker. This was the strategic horizon problem. Slaveholders did not need immediate abolition in order to panic. They only needed to believe that the long-term future would narrow slavery's room to expand, weaken Southern leverage in the federal government, and expose slave property to increasing criticism. Dred Scott had offered one sweeping legal defense. Electoral arithmetic suggested that defense might not hold forever if Northern political power kept growing. John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry in October 1859 sharpened Southern fear dramatically. Brown and a small band seized the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, hoping to trigger a wider slave uprising and guerrilla campaign in the mountains. The raid failed militarily. United States Marines under Robert E. Lee helped suppress it, and Brown was captured, tried, and executed. Yet the political effect far exceeded the military scale of the event. To white Southerners, Harper's Ferry suggested that anti-slavery politics might produce armed attack. To many Northerners, Brown appeared reckless, but some admired his willingness to die for the anti-slavery cause. The event widened sectional mistrust because each region read the same facts differently. A Southern editor could cite Brown as proof that slavery now faced violent Northern fanaticism. A Northern reformer could cite Brown's gallows speech as proof that slavery had created a moral emergency. Party structures broke down under these conditions. The Democratic Party split in 1860. Northern Democrats supported Stephen Douglas and his doctrine of popular sovereignty. Southern Democrats backed John C. Breckinridge and demanded stronger federal protection for slavery in the territories. Constitutional Union candidates tried to preserve old Unionist language, but the split in the Democrats made a Republican victory much easier. Lincoln won the presidency in 1860 without carrying the Deep South. That detail exposed the new sectional arithmetic. Southern elites saw that a president hostile to slavery's expansion could enter office without needing their electoral votes. Lincoln did not campaign on immediate abolition in the states where slavery already existed. He repeatedly said he lacked lawful authority to abolish slavery there. Yet his opposition to expansion threatened Southern power because containment threatened the future political balance. If slavery could not grow, then in the coming decades, the slave states might lose leverage in Congress, federal appointments, and the courts. The alternatives remained real even after the election. Southern leaders could have waited to see Lincoln's actual policy decisions. They could have used the Senate, the Supreme Court, and congressional bargaining to defend slaveholding interests. They could have tested whether Republican rhetoric would moderate in office. Instead, leading secessionists insisted that delay itself was dangerous. They argued that the election revealed an irreversible trend. Secession required more than anger. It required institutions. State leaders had to summon conventions, supervise delegate elections, circulate arguments, and prepare legal justifications for leaving the Union. That is why secession is best understood as organized political action rather than spontaneous regional eruption. South Carolina moved first. State leaders had a long history of claiming aggressive state sovereignty, and they acted quickly after Lincoln's election. A convention met in December 1860 and adopted an ordinance of secession. Other Deep South states followed: Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. In each case, political elites worked through formal state structures. Newspapers published speeches and draft arguments. Legislatures and governors coordinated responses. Militias and state officials began considering arsenals, forts, customs houses, and lines of communication. Convention procedure changed events because it gave secession a constitutional appearance. Delegates voted, clerks recorded the results. Ordinances and declarations were issued in formal language. Committees drafted explanations for domestic readers and foreign observers. The point was clear. Secessionists did not want to appear as a mob. They wanted to appear as lawful political actors defending sovereign communities. Class interests sat at the center of this mobilization. Large slaveholders and politicians most invested in the slave system drove the movement. Poor white Southerners did not all begin from the same position, but elite leadership shaped the available choices. Those elites understood slavery as labor system, property system, and social hierarchy. If the Republican rise threatened slavery's expansion, it threatened the political and economic order they led. Mississippi's declaration spoke directly to this point when it stated that its position was thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery. That language cuts through later attempts to blur the issue. The leaders of secession knew what they were protecting. They were protecting a labor order built on slavery and a political order built around its defense. Speed strengthened secessionist momentum too. Once one state left, secessionists in neighboring states could argue that delay would leave them isolated or defenseless. Momentum became part of the mechanism. Conventions met, declarations circulated, and each departure made the next one easier to imagine. The sequence itself became persuasive. Telegraph reports and partisan newspapers accelerated that sequence by carrying convention votes, militia movements, and federal fort rumors across the South within days. South Carolina delegates drafted the Declaration of the Immediate Causes which induce and justify the secession of South Carolina from the federal union to tell wavering white Southerners and outside observers exactly what they believed the union no longer protected: slavery. South Carolina complained of increasing hostility on the part of the non-slaveholding states to the institution of slavery. The Declaration also emphasized the failure of northern states to enforce fugitive slave obligations. Read carefully, the document does not float an abstract theory. It ties grievance to the security of slave property and to the constitutional arrangements that slaveholders believed had once protected it. The rhetoric of states' rights appears here, but it appears inside a slavery argument. South Carolina was not announcing that any local disagreement justified withdrawal. It was claiming that the Union had ceased to protect the particular rights Southern slaveholders considered essential. This distinction is decisive because later memory often tries to separate states' rights from slavery. The Declaration itself does not make that separation. The Declaration also shows how secessionists frame their action as legal defense rather than rebellion. They cited the Constitution, the compact theory of the Union, and the alleged failures of northern states. That form gave disunion an orderly surface. Conventions needed to persuade wavering Southerners, justify seizure of federal property, and present the South as rational rather than lawless. Constitutional language gave disunion an orderly surface. Set the Declaration beside Lincoln's actual position. He had promised to stop the expansion of slavery, not to march immediately into slave states and abolish it by decree. The Declaration therefore responds not to completed federal aggression, but to a feared future. That future alarmed secessionists enough that anticipatory fear became present action. The document also highlights the gap between national election and constitutional obedience. Secessionists were saying that a lawful result had produced an unacceptable future. Once that claim takes hold, the constitutional system is already in danger. By early 1861, the United States was moving from sectional political crisis to military confrontation because a bloc of Southern leaders had chosen disunion rather than continued participation in a union they no longer trusted to protect slavery. Secession therefore marked a threshold. Electoral defeat became grounds for state withdrawal. Constitutional loss became a reason to abandon constitutional process. Agency has to remain visible here. Dred Scott intensified the crisis. Harper's Ferry deepened fear. The Democratic split opened the electoral path. Lincoln's victory confirmed Southern weakness in the national vote. Yet none of those events forced immediate secession mechanically. Conventions, declarations, newspapers, governors, and elite networks translated those pressures into coordinated action. The next stage followed quickly. Confederate organization began in Montgomery, Alabama in February 1861. Delegates from seceded states formed a provisional government and drafted a Confederate Constitution. Federal forts, arsenals, and customs houses became immediate practical questions because disunion had to be territorial as well as rhetorical. The conflict could not remain a contest of declarations once both sides claimed lawful authority over the same spaces. The judgment problem remains sharp. Which factor did the most to make secession possible? Dred Scott's constitutional extremism, Harper's Ferry's fear effect, Lincoln's electoral victory, or elite convention mobilization? The answer should account for sequence. Dred Scott widened the legal stakes. Harper's Ferry widened the security stakes. Lincoln's election widened the political stakes. Convention mobilization turned all of that into disunion. The Charleston Democratic Convention and the later Baltimore Convention deserve direct attention because they made party fracture concrete. Southern delegates demanded a stronger federal slave code position. Douglas supporters resisted, delegates walked out. The party split into rival tickets, and that split reshaped the election map before a single November ballot was cast. This is mechanical politics. Convention rules, platform planks, delegate credentials, and floor votes changed the range of national outcomes. Secession also moved unevenly after Lincoln's victory. The Deep South acted first because slavery was most deeply tied to those states' political leadership and cotton economy. Upper South states waited longer and watched the federal response to Fort Sumter and Lincoln's troop call. That staggered sequence is decisive because it shows disunion building through stages rather than arriving in one regional burst. South Carolina's ordinance came in December 1860. Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas followed before Lincoln took office. Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina moved later, after war became undeniable. The Confederacy's Provisional Constitution, adopted in Montgomery in February 1861, also exposes what secessionists were trying to preserve. It closely resembled the United States Constitution in many structural respects, but it gave clear protection to slavery and state claims inside the new Union. The break with the old Union was therefore selective. Secessionists did not reject constitutional order itself. They rejected a constitutional order they believed no longer secured slave property strongly enough. The larger civic lesson is harsh. Constitutional systems do not break only when disagreement grows intense. They break when influential actors persuade enough people that lawful defeat is intolerable and that future loss is worse than immediate rupture. Southern secessionists reached that conclusion because they believed the Union no longer guaranteed the future of slavery. Their response was not drift, it was organized choice. That choice opened the path to war. Once states left, formed a rival government, and moved against federal authority, the conflict could no longer remain inside speeches and elections. The breakdown of compromise had now become the breakdown of union itself. Secession did not rise out of one election alone. It emerged from a sequence of legal, political, and convention choices made by leaders protecting slavery. The harder judgment is when anticipation of future loss becomes a license to destroy the constitutional order before the feared policy even arrives. The choice for disunion was deliberate long before the first battlefield clarified its cost.
If you're curious how I'm using AI to build these lectures and reshape higher education, visit thelibertytolearn.com. I'll see you in class.